Thanks for starting your week with us. Hello, I'm Lee Ji-yoon in Seoul. We have plenty of business news lined up for you this morning. We take a closer look at how the massive Trans-Pacific partnership would impact the Korean economy. The number of companies recalling children's products here in Korea has been on the rise, with 28 products recalled so far this year for violating safety regulations. We have these stories and more coming right up. Asian countries have agreed to push for a currency swap deal to facilitate local currency usage and trade deals within the region and wean countries off dependence on the U.S. dollar. The agreement was reached on Sunday in Azerbaijan during the ASEAN Plus 3 summit of finance leaders from ASEAN member states and Korea, China, and Japan. The countries also decided to promote ways to boost financial cooperation between Asian countries in order to prepare against potential financial crises stemming from external shocks. And following that meeting of Asian finance leaders, Korea's Finance Minister Choi Kyung-hwan told reporters that it was more important to manage liquidity flowing into the country than flowing out. He said a sudden withdrawal of funds following a U.S. Federal Reserve announcement was unlikely given Korea's strong economic fundamentals, current account surplus, and foreign exchange reserves. He noted it was more important to focus on the money entering the domestic markets, adding that the macro-prudential regulations in place since the 2008 global economic crisis were still relevant. Korean households have been feverishly borrowing from banks on the heels of a booming real estate market and a record low key interest rate. The Financial Supervisory Service says outstanding household loans in March reached roughly $487 billion, growing by $3.7 billion. This is the largest margin of increase in 9 years for the month of March. Just in the area of Seoul, about 13,000 homes were traded in March, up roughly by 50% from February. Now, parents, you might want to double check the toys that you're going to buy for your children this coming Children's Day here in Korea. A government organization recently found that popular toys on the market contain harmful chemical substances that pose danger to children. Our Lee Ju-young has the story.
From this baby carriage to this tricycle, these goods are just a few of the 28 products recalled for violating safety regulations in Korea this year. This typical hairpin for kids had 500 times more lead than the accepted baseline, and this mini urinal came laced with chemicals that can cause major disorders in the internal organs. According to the Korean Agency for Technology and Standards, the number of companies that issued product recalls in 2011 was at 33, but that figure climbed steadily to 165 last year, increasing five-fold over the past 3 years. The agency tested over 1,200 products on the market last year in January and found that out of the 35 products warranting recalls, the majority were imported from China and Vietnam and did not come with authorized safety certificates. There's also growing concern that the danger posed by such faulty products coming directly from overseas may grow exponentially as more consumers make purchases of children's goods online without adequate screening processes. But for those that come through channels with accountability, the government says it will boost its efforts for quality control.
In the case of children's toys, clothes, and other related goods, we will step up monitoring so that consumers can use them without having to worry.
And with many family holidays scheduled in May, the Korea Customs Service said it will enforce strict regulations to prevent illegal imports and provide a safer experience for young users. Lee Ju-young, Business Daily.
Interest in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the TPP, is now higher than ever, following Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's recent visit to the U.S. Now, once an agreement is reached on the TPP, it's expected to bring about a sweeping change in the global market. Let's take a closer look.
Just last week, the US and Japan agreed to cooperate to make progress on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, saying it will help the workers of both countries. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, is a free trade agreement currently being negotiated among 12 countries surrounding the Pacific, including the US and Japan. The participating 12 countries represent 11% of the world population and 39% of the global GDP. Some experts say the leading participants will try to wrap up TPP negotiations in the first half of the year, as the US presidential election and Japan's upper house election are both scheduled for next year. Korea's finance minister said last month Seoul plans to take part in a fresh round of talks on the TPP membership, but the country has yet to make a final decision on whether to join the trade agreement. Will the trade deal help Korea and its economy? And how will it affect bilateral trade deals Korea has already established?
And to tell us more about this, we're now joined by Professor Yang Jun-seok from the Catholic University of Korea. Good morning, Professor.
Morning.
All right, so how about we start off by talking about what exactly the TPP is?
Okay, well, TPP is basically an FTA, but instead of doing it bilaterally, that is with two countries, we're doing it with a group of countries in a region. So the convenient thing is, whereas sometimes if we use goods from country A as an intermediate good and export from country B, sometimes if country B and country C forms an FTA, that intermediate good from another country will make it difficult to get a tariff exemption. But with these type of multiple country FTAs, you have what's called a cumulative rule of origin, so that those type of intermediate goods trade will also be subject to reductions in tariffs.
All right, well, the U.S. and Japan seem to be racing to get this TPP deal concluded ahead of their main political events lined up for next year. Do you see a possibility of that being concluded anytime soon?
Okay, there's two big hurdles. The first is the United States, the Congress has to pass what's called a trade promotion authority. That basically limits Congress to seeing the results of the negotiation and either taking all of it as is or rejecting it as is. The reason that is so important is that if the Congress does not give the Trade Promotion Authority, the TPA, to the president, then Congress, at least according to the U.S. Constitution, has the right to nitpick every little line on the FTA negotiation. So they really need the TPA, but there's a lot of political problems with the Obama administration that makes it difficult for them to get the TPA. Obama has to get a coalition of Republicans and Democrats together to pass this bill because, well, some Republicans don't like the Obama administration so much that they're not willing to give this large power to him. And then a lot of the Democrats don't want to give trade promotion authority to the president because they think that the TPA requires stronger labor standards and some standards on currency manipulation. So foreign exchange rate manipulation, so that's going to be very difficult. Now, the second problem is negotiation between basically Japan and all the other countries. Most of the other countries in the TPP really want agricultural market to open a lot more. Japan obviously do not. So that's the second hurdle that they have to go over.
Okay, well, shifting our gears a bit to Korea. Korea had expressed interest in joining the TPP back in 2013, but it hasn't really been official about its joining it in its official membership. Why so?
Okay, well, part of the reason is that Korea already has TPP FTAs with all the members of the TPP except Japan. So a lot of Korean analysts think that the effect is not going to be that big. But on the other hand, research do show that there will be not big but moderately good effects for Korea if Korea joins the TPP, and very small negative effect if Korea does not join the TPP. So it's in Korea's interest to join the TPP, but I think we missed the chance to join the TPP because after Japan joined in, As I said before, all the other countries were interested in agricultural market opening, while Japan really was trying not to open its agricultural market. And I think the U.S. now calculates that if Korea joins the negotiation at this stage, then that's going to make the negotiations even longer because Korea is known for not wanting to open its agricultural market.
Okay, well, then at this point, you already mentioned a little bit about it, but we want to know a little bit more about how we will be able to benefit from this TPP deal if Korea joins it.
Well, as I mentioned, most of the FTAs that Korea signed is bilateral. So there have been some problems about how to deal with intermediate goods. That has actually been a major problem in the Korea-US FTA because we import a lot of, say, yarn from China, and that how it adds up to the value added was a major contention in the Korea-US FTA negotiations. Also, some of the effects that Korea will see is that because most of the other countries do want additional agricultural market opening, if Korea joins the TPP, there's a real possibility that Korea will have to additionally open the agricultural market. And if Korea opens the agricultural market to the TPP countries, there's also some possibility that it will have to open to other FTA partners as well. So obviously, a lot of the agricultural interests are not really looking forward to joining the TPP.
All right, well, aside from the agricultural aspect, like we said, Korea has already established FTAs with a lot of countries around the world. Is it really going to deal a blow to all of that?
Okay, as I said, we may have to give additional market opening, additional opening in agriculture and investment, and other countries who do not belong to TPP will obviously want Korea to match that effort. So that's going to have some effect on the existing FTAs. But as I mentioned before, Korea Institute for International Economic Policy ran a computer simulation on how TPP would affect Korea. And their results show that if Korea joins the TPP, then over 10 years, Korea will gain about 2.6% GDP over 10 years. Whereas if we don't join the TPP, then Korea will lose about 0.011% of the GDP. So it's in Korea's interest to join when you add up the winnings and losses.
All right, well, I guess we have a lot to keep an eye on since a lot of them are still happening, right?
Right.
Okay. Thank you for coming in today, Professor.
Thank you.
All right, that wraps it up for now. We'll be back tomorrow with more, so don't forget to tune in then. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.